John Nutley, and today we're going to have the second episode in our story of Rossmoor. In our first episode, we talked about the Sakhalin Indians, and today we're going to talk about the Spanish and the missionaries and how they influenced the area in which we live. Before we begin, we ought to say something about Spain's position on its colonies. Spain believed that all land belonged to the king, and as such he had the right to do what he pleased with the land. It so happened that the reason Spain came up the California coast was to protect its colony of New Spain, or Mexico. It also was important that it have a place where its Manila galleons that came from the Philippines every year had a place to refurbish themselves after the long trip across the ocean. In the Pacific at this time was the growing menace of French, English, and Russian ships, all of which caused Spain to be concerned about the colony. Greatly enhanced by this problem was the desire to establish religious communities. The religious communities already been established in Baja California, and the desire to move northward was very important. So in 1769, Portola was sent north to explore and perhaps find a bay that would be of value. The ship San Carlos was sent as a subsidiary expedition. In the years that followed, De Anza and Vargas were to send up expeditions also, all directed by mandate from the viceroy in New Spain. These expeditions explored the coast, and Vargas led the expedition that was to come to Contra Costa County. In 1772, he led an expedition of 12 men up the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, through Carquinez Straits, and on to Martinez and to Pittsburgh. From the heights above Pittsburgh, he was able to see the delta of the Sacramento and the snow-capped mountains of the Sierra in the distance. Realizing that there was no way to move north on a land expedition, he turned back. The Indians suggested that rather than going through the hills at Carquinez Strait, they go up Walnut Creek and eventually come to the south end of the bay. Perhaps it was when they stopped at Danville at the night's camp that they met the Sakhalin Indians, because the Sakhalin Indians certainly knew about them from their neighbors in the adjacent areas. The mission of San Francisco and the Presidio there was established in 1775 with De Anza's second trip to the Bay Area. The missions offered a number of positive and negative credits to the Indians. They offered them an opportunity to learn more about a new religion. There were new tools, new skills, new foods, new clothing, new everything that was a value to the Spanish and offered as an enticement to the Indians. Of course, there were negatives as well. The negatives were that there was a routine which was new to the Indians. They had to learn to live in a more tightly organized community, and the life itself was not going to be as easy as the life before. Baptism was an essential part of becoming a mission Indian. Indians would get tired of this life, and so the missionaries would offer them a paseo. A paseo amounted to a vacation. It gave them the opportunity to go back to their tribe and then come back after a due length of time to the mission. Well, of course, some of them decided not to come back, and that created problems. So the missionaries would send convertos those that had already received baptism, to come and rescue them from the village life and bring them back to the mission. One such expedition was met at the shore by Indians, including Sakhalins, and chased them back onto their boats and sent them back to the mission in San Francisco. This certainly upset the Padres, and so they asked the soldiers at the Presidio to go over there and get back the Indians that belonged at the mission. Well, the soldiers at the Presidio said, hey, you got to try again. We're not going to go over there. So the mission fathers sent another expedition of convertos over there to the Oakland shore to get the Indians. They landed safely, moved inland, and finally came to the Sakhalin Indian village. At that time, the Sakhalins and their neighbors were having a meeting in the Temescal, which is a sweat hut, sort of like a sauna, only in a large scale. When they realized that these people were there, they came charging out with their weapons. And in the battle that ensued, 7 of the convertos were killed, and the rest fled back to the missions. Of course, this was a terrible blow to the missions. And when the soldiers found out about it, they were very upset, and they notified the governor in Monterey. Now, Governor Michael Torrenta was upset, but he wasn't quite ready to do anything about this because they were right in the process of establishing 4 new missions. Father Lozoen, who had succeeded Padre Serra as the father president of the missions, was very much concerned, but he was more concerned about establishing the missions than he was about rescuing the Sakhalin Indians and solving the problem. The Sakhalins were very much the dominant force in Contra Costa County at this time. They tried to convince other tribes not to go to that new mission at San Jose. And so it was 2 years before a military expedition was sent to chastise the Sakhalins and to get the ones back to that had killed the convertos. Sergeant Amador took 20 men and planned to sneak up on the Sakhalin village. But of course, the Sakhalins quickly learned about the coming of the soldiers, and so they prepared a trap for them. In the morning, when Sergeant Amador and his troops arrived at the village, they were in for a surprise, and a long-range battle ensued. A number of Indians were killed and soldiers were wounded. But after several hours, the Spanish were able to capture a number of the residents, chase away others, and they had a little testing of there. They were questioning. Some of them were freed with a warning. Others were bound as convertos or people who had involved in the murder of the convertos. The Spanish proceeded further along, and they were attacked a second time. Again, the battle ensued. The Indians were driven off, and more prisoners were taken. Going further, they came up to San Pablo Bay area, where they captured some additional prisoners, and then proceeded down the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay to San Jose. In the trial that followed, some of the Indians were chained. Some of the other ones were given slashes. 24 lashes were not uncommon. The law prevented more than 25 at a time. The colonial situation now existed that most of the area was safely under Spanish control. And in the years that followed, up into the early 1800s, most of the Indians had moved to the missions. This was a period of Spanish colonial life. We will talk more about that later, but first we ought to talk a little bit about what's happening in the world. At that time in Europe was a period of Napoleon and his conquest. In the New World, the Spanish colonies were upset because they wanted more control of their own destiny. So by 1810, Mexico decided to revolt and establish its own government. It was going to take 10 long years for this to happen. But by the early 1820s, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain, and many of the colonies in South America were also gaining their independence. We had talked about land grants at the beginning. At this time, in the late Spanish period, they began to issue land grants. And when Mexico took over, they confiscated the mission lands and began issuing their own land grants. The first land grant that was issued in this area was to the Peralta family in 1820. Their land grant extended from below the town of Alameda up to beyond Berkeley, quite a large area. This was later subdivided amongst his three sons. Also in 1823, Ignacio Martinez received a land grant along Carquinez Strait, and in the following year, Castro received a land grant in San Pablo and that area. This was a good way of rewarding retiring officers and men who had served time in the Spanish military. We have today in Contra Costa County a lot of names that suggest land grants that were issued by the Mexican government. Pacheco, Galindo, Sanchez, Del Valle, Briones, Moraga. These were all names of families that received land grants. The haciendadas, the people who own these large ranchos, would have parties and celebrations, fiestas, fandangos, rodeos, and they would have visitations when they would go and socialize with their neighbors. This was a good introduction to marriages, and this was one way that they kept the bond of friendship existing between the various ranches. At this time, foreign ships were also coming into the area, and they offered tools and furniture and equipment that was very difficult for the Spanish settlers to enjoy and have here. They paid for these materials with hides. They were called California dollars. The cattle that the Spanish raised was slaughtered, and the hides were dried and stacked up for when the ships came in so they could trade it for supplies that they couldn't get from south of them in Mexico. It was also the time when American explorers came into the area. James Walker came across from the Salt Lake area. Jedediah Smith came up from the south. He was one of the early explorers. We have John Sutter, who was to eventually obtain a land grant where we have Sacramento today. Thomas Larkin came to Monterey, and he received a land grant. So land grants were quite common at this period. Moraga got his land grant. A man by the name of William Welsh received a land grant of Los Juntas. This is where the Pleasant Hill BART station today is. Of particular interest was one of these families was the Romero Brothers. The Romero's grandfather had come north as a soldier for De Anza, and the Romeros felt that they ought to have a land grant too. These three brothers, Jose, Mario, and Inocencio, came exploring in the Contra Costa area, and they found this lovely valley that had a spring near the beginning of it that would be a great place to raise cattle. And they felt that they were completely free of the land grants to other people. So they proceeded to set up housekeeping. They built a little house. They planted some corn and some beans and some melons, brought in some cattle and horses, and began to occupy the area we know today as our valley. Of particular interest at this time was that they petitioned to have a land grant, and this was in 1843, several years after they had settled down. The government said, hey, we need more information. Get the other people to measure their land so that we know what the boundaries are of your petition. The Romero petition was for a sobrante. A sobrante is a piece of land outside of existing boundaries. So they wanted the land in between the other land grants. This land grant would be about 5 leagues, 5 square leagues. So when this petition came, we have a map of their grant request, so it's available. Before they could really get everything squared away, the war broke out between Mexico and the United States. This created a stoppage of everything, and the American troops under Kearny came from Texas to California, defeated the California soldiers down in Southern California. Commodores Sloat and Stockton came north in American ships and captured Monterey and San Francisco, and before we knew it, the whole war was over as far as California was concerned. By the Treaty of Peace of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Americans guaranteed to respect the land grants made by Spain and Mexico. But in order to prove that they had a land grant, every grantee was requested to bring out the papers of his land grant for verification before American judges. These judges heard their court cases in English, which meant that the haciendados had to hire American lawyers to defend them and present their case to court. Well, how were they going to pay the American lawyers? By giving them a share of the land grant. Well, the court cases lasted for many years, and in many cases, by the time the court case was finished, the American lawyers owned the land, but the land grant was legal. It made it very difficult for many of them. Inocencio Romero, the younger of the brothers, who by this time was the leading advocate of the Romero claim, began to realize that it wouldn't be a good idea to rely upon his claim that had not really been granted to him. So he began to sell off parcels of his land grant. And one of the people that bought land grant was James W. Tice. James W. Tice paid $8,000 for 373 acres. These 373 acres included the spring at the entrance to the valley. So when the Romero Brothers land grant was denied, James W. Tice was very much concerned. He was enraged, in fact, that he had spent $8,000 for nothing. He had this land, but did he own it? Did it really belong to him? So it was up to him to defend that land grant, and he did manage to hold on to it by squatter's right as we came to know it. What happened to the Romero brothers? They disappeared into history, and the next time we have to talk about is James W. Tice and his successors in Rossmoor Valley.